Like some of you, I'm sure, I grew up on dramas like The Heirs, Boys Over Flowers. Basically, any drama where the main character was from a super rich family, the other character was from a super poor family, and they had a forbidden romance where the father or the mother of the rich person was vehemently against the relationship. One of the most common K-drama tropes. We don't see it as much nowadays, but it was so popular in these iconic dramas, and we see little elements of it still today that I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about the idea of JEBOL and wealth and class in Korea. Now, as someone who is from a Korean family, who has homes in Korea, established relatives in Korea, I'm gonna also try to sort of insert myself as to where I fall in this spectrum of wealth and class in Korea with as much of an objective assessment as I can without going into too much personal or financial detail. But I do want to give you a more insider or personal glimpse into sort of what a typical middle class or upper middle class household can look like. One thing about JEBOL, and yes, it's JEBOL, J, not JEBOL. I don't know where that came from. I understand it sounds less like a J and more like a Che when you say the whole word like JEBOL, but the actual Korean letter that's used is a J sound. So one quick thing to get clear out of the way about JEBOL is that it does not simply refer to a rich individual. JEBOL is a family or someone who's part of a family that owns these major corporations within Korea. And the top JEBOLs right now include Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Lotte, SK, and the list sort of goes on and on, but these are the top big JEBOLs that you will see, and you see these names like everywhere on all kinds of products, advertisements. I talk about this a little bit in my IMF video because these were the mega corporations that were partly responsible, who had certain impacts on the IMF crisis. So when you see these super rich JEBOL families in dramas like The Heirs or Boys Over Flowers, it is accurate to say that these individuals or these families own not just one small company, but maybe several companies or a big family group of companies. And this has been controversial in the past just because of the kind of old-fashioned hierarchical way of passing down these companies down a family line as opposed to hiring a competent CEO. And I think some of those traditions are changing now, but it is still very true that these major corporations and the families behind them are considered JEBOLs. And there are some shows like Penthouse which display the newer wealth that's not just passed down by the generations. It is hard to pinpoint old wealth or old money in Korea just because we were not a very rich country just 100 years ago. All of the wealth that's accumulated, even by these big companies, are not more than 50-ish years old. It was only after the Korean War that the economy started to rebuild itself. And so it's hard to call any of the wealth other than these big companies actually old wealth. We were a very, very poor country. And now a lot of the wealth that's accumulated by individuals come from certain occupations like medicine, law, a lot of business owners, celebrities. This makes up a very, very few top tier of Korea. The whole issue of the wealth gap, especially between the average middle class and the very, very top wealthy, is quite severe. And then of course you get down to the lower working class, those in low income jobs, those living on the streets. I addressed a lot of these in my IMF video. In this video, I'm going to talk more specifically about how wealth can look on a more practical, everyday basis. I do think it's safe to say that there is a little bit of that visible division between new money and old money, or between these JEBOLs or people who have been in stable income families for a long time, like children of 공무원s, which are government workers, to say that they're not as flashy with their logos and designer labels as these new money people. But it's also hard to say it's just a rich person thing, because even if you're not necessarily part of that top tier wealth, many people do still want to show off designer logos, and it is very popular to do it. So luxury goods are almost not really an indicator of wealth itself, because so many people, even in the middle to upper middle class income bracket, aspire to it. Now, of course, it's not accessible to everyone, but there are definitely a lot of people who fake it. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just saying that that's the reality. And presenting yourself in a certain way, looking a certain way in public to appear as if you have more wealth is just very common. Why is that the case? Well, I think there are several reasons. Part of them being that appearance is very important in Korean culture, but also that housing in Korea is ridiculous. It's really hard to say as a young working professional that you will be able to have your own home or even to to rent out a nice place on a beginning income. And nice in terms of home can't always refer to size. So if you see someone in a Korean apartment that is quite spacious and new, with a large living room, lots of balconies, open space, that could be considered quite wealthy. We live in a small country and we have a lot of people. And this probably applies to other Asian countries as well, where we don't have the spatial luxury for large homes, even if we do have a sufficient amount of money. And so it almost seems unfair that even as someone in upper middle class and for the same amount of money, the size of your home may not actually reflect that. And of course, that's all very relative. Like if I were to be a rich person in Canada, for example, I remember a lot of my friends from Canada had very, very large homes, and they were only considered upper middle class at most. And that's just the luxury of the resources you have in your country. Land is a huge resource. And so because of the limited size, wealth in Korea will not necessarily look like mansions, but they may look like very safe and secure apartment complexes. My uncle's apartment is one of those. Guys, it is so difficult just to get into the apartment itself. My uncle says that the worst thing you could do as someone who lives in one of these apartments is to order delivery, because it's so complicated for the delivery person just to get the food to your doorstep. Getting delivery to an apartment is just a hassle anyways. Imagine like the security codes, the parking, the guards. Like this wealthy apartment complex from All of Us Are Dead is a pretty good example of what richness in Korea might look like. And a lot of celebrities live in apartments like this. There's a specific one in Seoul Forest. All these celebrities, they all tend to kind of clump together in these buildings that are well protected for obvious reasons. If you don't have a big house but you still want to show that you're rich or upgrade your life to the level of quality that you can afford, and things you can show or things you can use practically. You have a lot of tools. Quality of clothing might be another. You may only purchase clothes at department stores or places where you can have the luxury to try clothes on and fit them for size. Education. Now, of course, that is huge, and you've seen in dramas like Sky Castle and Penthouse just how much parents are willing to pour out into their children's education. There's hagwons, there's private tutoring, and because it's just common throughout Korean families, again, you have to sort of distinguish between what kind of hagwons are they going to? Are they going to an all English speaking kindergarten? Are they going to very specialized schools? There isn't a whole lot of private education in Korea unless you want to send your kid to an international school, but there are high schools that are specialized in certain subjects. But again, even if you live in a wealthy area like Gangnam or Daechidong, it's still not that common to send your kids to a private school, and if you do, it'll end up being like a foreign language school. It'll definitely focus more towards an English-based education. For the most part, a lot of the money is poured out instead into hagwons and after-school education rather than a completely separate private school. I mentioned a little bit about wealthier areas around Seoul, especially if you live in the center of Seoul, like Gangnam, Shinsa, Apgujeong, very close to Hangang, or the river that splits Seoul in two. That's going to be a lot of where the upper middle class wealthy of Seoul clump together. Now, I don't know as much about outside of Seoul, but it's safe to say that in the city, there are definitely not a lot of these giant mansions that we see in dramas. But if you do own property anywhere close to the center of the city, that would be considered a huge asset. In terms of jobs, I've already mentioned some of the careers that are associated with wealth, and it's not very different from places like the States. People in the medical track, especially working for big hospitals, 공무원s or government officials, large corporation business people, those are definitely considered some of the high income, stable careers. Now, as for my own family, this apartment that I'm in right now is my grandmother's, and we do own this apartment. And it doesn't have very high security because it's a very old building, but it's definitely spacious. And because we own it and property prices are rising, it's definitely going to be a big asset. We're very lucky to have this apartment. It's been in our family for over 30 years, and so we were definitely able to purchase it when the housing prices weren't so crazy. Now it's just getting worse and worse every day, and honestly, it is a huge concern of most young Korean people whether they'll ever be able to afford a house here. And so there's actually a lot of investment funds and different kinds of ways banks try to help young people between like 20s and 30s in Korea to have enough funds to buy property in the future. Minimum wage still hits around the manwon or $10, which is better than before, but it is still pretty tight for the city. I'm just so used to prices and minimum wage in the States that at first to me prices here seemed really low. An average rent here could be around 500,000 won. That's much much lower than where I was in California, but that's all balanced by the average wage as well. So I think it's difficult to say if you're in my age bracket that you have a lot of wealth unless you're born into one of those super JEBOL families, just because of the increasing income gap and the fewer job opportunities. And I think it's a reason a lot of people are trying to go abroad as well. I feel fortunate. I think that I am in a stable enough position. Both my grandparents were 공무원s. My dad, has a stable job, but it's not going to be an easy future for me or anyone born after me. But yeah, I do think that wealth here can look different from in other countries, especially countries with more resources, more land, and a deeper history in accumulated wealth. Maybe one reason Korea has a lot of problems with managing its wealth is because it is newer as a whole. But I will wrap up here. Let me know if you have any more questions in the comments below, and I'll see you soon.